Enlightenment is a very frequently used term, especially in philosophy. It's a term that comes up when we talk about spirituality, and also sometimes when we talk about things like historical European art and science. So it comes up in that context too. However, the definition is really ambiguous to most people who haven't explored the authentic teachings of the Dharma. Because in contrast, a Buddhist from any school of Buddhism is taught very specific definitions of enlightenment, each with specific differentiations depending on the level of attainment. In almost all other contexts, the term lacks precise characteristics and levels. So because of the misuse of the term, many people are misled or quite uncertain about what it really entails in the spiritual context. Not remain if you don't stay in the jhanas 24/7, moment to moment, continuously, then you're not at that level. You don't live in the jhanas. You're not quite at that level. You're a bit lower than that. And so Sotāpannas can maintain the household life. They can experience emotional reactions of anger and desire if directly provoked. But their reactions tend to be milder, and they will not cause perverse or violent behavior. There's enough dispassion that the person is not motivated or inspired to act on their reactions. So one is not absolutely free of defects, but it's possible to, so you can experience some depression and some annoyance and desire, but he or she is well on their way to complete enlightenment. And this is something that could happen in the next 10 minutes or in the next year or so, or even life or so. It depends how rigorously you work and what kind of stimulants are out there in the world to trigger the defects and, break them, to stimulate your mind and consciousness so it can feed on it and then comprehend. Sometimes it's something like going on a plane, a long plane ride and you haven't done that for a while. So there's that anxiety. Maybe if you have a little bit of a worry of having to stay on a plane, and the sound of it makes you anxious, and the feeling of going up in the air, that could be the last thing that you have to comprehend. If it's been 5 or 10 years since you were on a plane, it could just be a little bit of anxiety that you need to get rid of. Or public speaking. It could be anything, and it just by exposing yourself to certain stresses, your mind has to get used to it, and if you do that a few times, and boof, that's the end of it. You've cleaned away the rest of your mind for the Sotāpanna to arise. Now, it's also taught that Sotāpannas can take a maximum of 7 lifetimes to attain complete liberation. Regarding the meditative jhanas, Sotāpannas may or may not be able to access the jhanas at will. There are many who can't, or are still working on that. And the ones who cannot refer to their ability to enter the jhanas as the indicator of their enlightenment, since many people who practice meditation can become skillful enough and enter the jhanas regularly without having eliminated all of their psychological defects. So it's possible to train yourself and be skillful at meditation, but it doesn't guarantee that your mind is pure. And that's what enlightenment is all about: purifying the mind, eliminating defects or aggregates. When you eliminate the aggregates enough, then the consciousness naturally awakens, and that's why it's easier and easier to experience the jhanas or just live in them, because there's so much that you've freed up. Now, the second stage of enlightenment is called sakkayaditthi, which means once returner. This means that a full enlightenment can be attained in 1 or 2 lives, hence the possible need to return once to complete the work. At this stage, no fetters remain. The 5th and 6th fetters in particular, anger and desire, are further reduced to atomic dust, rendering the awakened one perfectly ethical in action and will, free from desire and negativity, and highly pure psychologically. Although anger and desire are substantially diminished at this level, it is possible to experience these dense emotions if provoked. These defects still exist in a very dormant state, but they don't arise spontaneously, as with in negative thinking. You don't fantasize into bouts of anger or negativity as easily, or if at all. Now, this is an advanced state of enlightenment. However, sakkayaditthis don't always have the ability, they don't always have the ability to enter the jhanas at will. So that's about the sakkayaditthi. Moving on to the 3rd stage. This is anagami. This is becoming a very high stage of enlightenment that we're dealing with here. This literally means non-future or non-returner, in which the word future refers to agami, karma, or karmic consequences that will occur in the future. So anagami can also be translated as without future karma. There will be no need to return in future lives to complete the great liberation. The anagami stage is usually just called the non-returning stage. This is a highly exalted level of attainment in which 5 of the 10 fetters, including the dense ones of anger, greed, and lust, have been completely eliminated. And by nature, anagamis are intrinsically pure. So not only do they share the same ethical lifestyle as monks and nuns, but they're naturally this way. They're naturally just very pure and gentle. They're celibate and psychologically cleansed of sensual and material desires. These individuals are divorced from the usual material motivations of people, or sensual motivations. And it is possible to continue living like a layperson in the household life at the anagami stage, and there are several Buddhist narratives that illustrate this. One of them being the story of Gatikara, the potter, who was unable to live in a monastery because he had to tend to his aged and blind parents. He was content with his lifestyle because he saw no lasting value in the common worldly life. Now with anagami, the last 5 fetters remain, and they're very subtle. There tends to remain attachment and pleasure in the various meditative states, particularly the jhanas and the arupa meditations, or the formless realms. These are the higher jhanas, you could say the 8 jhanas, the last 4. So these formless attainments, these attachments are very refined though, as they are of a spiritual nature, but they are nonetheless the obstacles still. There still remains the subtle affliction of mental restlessness, for which anagami is the subtle movement or wandering of the mind from thought to thought. So this means that although the mind is substantially pure, it's not fundamentally still and free of habitual or mechanical thoughts and aggregates. And this is why we have dreams that don't make sense, and we kind of hallucinate things when we go to bed and sleep, because the mind naturally and mechanically has its own rhythm and movement. Even when you're not making the effort to have thoughts or to think about things, the mind is moving. It's creating images and thoughts. So the movement of this type of mind is akin to a gentle breeze that rustles the leaves from time to time. But having said that, the mind of an anagami is not perversely active. It's not constantly distracted by impressions. It's not agitated like the thoughts in the case of everyday people. Now, another remaining fetter is known as conceit, which at this stage remains just as a trace sense of self. But this sense of self is not considered sakkayaditthi, or a conviction of and sense of individual self, because that was already eliminated at the Sotāpanna first stage. This residual sense of self is comparable to washing out a strong stain from a turmeric sauce or cherries, for example. You may be able to wash out the majority of the stain, the strong color, the grease, and the smell, but then what remains is, when you wash out a really strong dye out of something immediately, or a strong stained clothing, if you do it right away, you get most of it out, but there's still this slight, and it's clean, right? It's clean, but for some reason there's a slight discoloration. Maybe there's a slight smell to it. It goes from white to off-white, or a yellowish white, or something like that. So at the same time, because trace amounts of the fetters exist, technically ignorance still remains to some extent. So it's generally at the level of anagami when one can access the jhanas and samadhi very easily, and there's more inclination to do so. And the final stage of enlightenment is known as arahant. In some variations are arahat. The title and lifestyle and the way of the arahant can be called arahantship. And at this level of awakening, the remaining 5 fetters, attachment to meditative states, conceit, restlessness of the mind, and ignorance, are all reduced to cosmic dust, and the awakened one becomes a completely unconditioned, enlightened being. Upon attaining this, future rebirths in the physical plane are no longer necessary, and since the arahant is fully awakened, it's possible that their natural and ongoing state of consciousness can remain in samadhi. These people can walk and talk in samadhi, whereas most practitioners fall asleep physically when they attain this, only attaining samadhi and sleep, basically like lucid dreams. These arahants are naturally in samadhi all the time. With that being said, it's not necessary that the arahant has the ability to easily access the arupa formless meditations. That's not a requisite of enlightenment, and it's not intrinsic to arahantship. But one thing that is worth considering is that some schools of Buddhism caution students to not become too attached to the bliss of the jhanas and the form, or even formless heavens. But this is somewhat contradictory advice, because it's not even possible to become free of the attachment to the jhanas until one reaches arahantship. In fact, the Buddha taught that samadhi, the 4th jhana, is the final step in the Eightfold Path. So the jhanas and samadhi are in fact a means to final liberation. The jhanas themselves are a means of liberation from the attachment to jhana. Interesting, right? So finally, it's also important to be aware that the ability to experience the jhanas and samadhi at will, again, is not an indication that one is fully enlightened.